Hello and good morning. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. We're going to give folks another moment to log in, but we'll be starting very soon. That's about enough time for everyone to be logging in. So let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022-23 Better Buildings webinar series. We're dedicated to bringing you the latest actionable insights from leading industry experts. This annual series is a chance to explore topics in depth, technologies and trends that affect you and your organizations, as well as efforts to accelerate decarbonization and energy efficiency adoption. Today's webinar is called Show Me the Money, Financing Decarbonization Projects. Before we dive in, there's a couple housekeeping points I want to cover. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the Better Building Solutions Center. We'll follow up with today's recording and slides when they're made available. Next, all attendees are in listen-only mode, meaning that your microphones are muted. If you experience any audio or visual issues throughout the webinar, please send us a message in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And we'll discuss shortly how to send us questions during the presentation, because we're very interested in hearing what you most care about. Next slide, please. My name is Kyle Saltzman, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a member of RETEC Advisors, and I've helped co-lead the financial sector engagement with the Better Buildings program for the better part of 3 years. Before that, I spent 5 years based in DC working at a financing organization called Spark Fund, and I'm really excited to share some remarks with you today, as well as introduce our speakers soon. Next slide, please. We'll be hearing from 3 speakers, including Peter Ludwig from Connecticut Green Bank, Martin Powell from Siemens Financial Services, and Natalie Campos-Goodman from Incentifind. I'll introduce them properly in just a moment, but first I wanted to start with a few slides to set the stage for our presentation today. Next slide, please. First, I wanted to start with this trend graph that really shows that the trend towards decarbonization and decarbonization commitments has shifted from just a trend that some leading organizations ambitiously would take on, and has really become a true paradigm shift with how organizations are expected to lead and operate in the market today. Huge proportions of the largest organizations are adopting commitments to meaningfully reduce their emissions through a number of different frameworks. And this graph, by the way, doesn't include DOE's Better Climate Challenge, which some of you may have already joined and which you are welcome to join if your organization hasn't already. So the point is that there's a lot of ground to cover, both for avoiding the worst effects of climate change, but also for companies just to realize the commitments that they've made in order to achieve the necessary participation in these frameworks. Next slide, please. And to do this is going to require a massive deployment of capital. This capital is going to come from a number of different places. It can come from internal sources, capital expenditures from organizations, but we know that external capital sources are going to be a major part of how this happens. This includes funding sources like grants, incentives, sources of capital that don't need to be repaid, as well as financing sources, third-party capital that's used and requires some form of repayment in order to access that capital. This is going to happen at scale. It's going to happen at a utility scale. It's going to happen at a state and national scale, but it's also going to happen at the local scale, even down to individual facilities and small and medium-sized businesses who are also going to need to make and participate in this deployment in order for the necessary progress that has to happen to occur. Learning how to access these various sources of capital is the core point of today's session. Next slide, please. And it's a confusing space. Let's be clear about that. But you aren't alone in trying to understand it and navigate the space. One of the resources available to you are the financial allies. These are participants in the DOE's Better Buildings programs. And these are organizations that come from a wide variety of different perspectives. We have banks, we have dedicated financiers who specialize in a particular financing method like PACE, or Energy as a Service. We even have CDFIs and some insurance companies who have joined this organization specifically to provide guidance and answer the questions that you might have about how you access third-party financing capital. We're joined today by Incentifind, who's not a financial ally, but is an organization that specializes in trying to navigate non-financing methods, so grants and incentives. And we're really, again, we're looking forward to that part of the presentation as well. Financial allies have deployed in aggregate over $2 billion since joining the program. So they operate at a tier that is meaningful for the total progress that needs to happen. But the key point is that these organizations are available to you to answer any questions that you have. And you can reach out to them through the Better Building Solutions Center. Next slide, please. In addition to providing access to experts in how to access financing sources, DOE also provides a number of resources specifically meant to demystify how third-party finance works. A chief resource among them is the Financing Navigator, accessible through the link here, and we'll be sharing this link among as well as several others after this presentation today. The Financing Navigator contains fact sheets on how each financing mechanism, both third-party capital as well as some sources of internal capital, be they green revolving funds or even capital raising structures such as green bonds, how it all works. If you've seen these terms, you're aware that they might be affecting your organization, might be resources relevant to your organization, you can go to the Better Building Solutions Center and learn exactly how these work and get in contact with financial allies who specialize in each of these sources if your organization is interested in taking advantage of them. Next slide, please. So we'll be hearing from some financial allies today on how all of this works. But first I wanted to start with a quick poll and just learn more about who's joining us. So if you could join us at slido.com and enter the code hashtag DOE, that'll get you access to a welcome poll, which we'll go over in just a moment, as well as how you can submit questions to them, each of the session speakers today. So again, if you have any questions for us, you can go there. Excellent news for Anonymous. If you're able to enter DOE, you were already successfully logged into Slido. So we're going to start with a poll, which is what sector best describes your organization that you're joining from today. It's always helpful for us to know who's joining so we can factor that into some of our questions. Give just a little bit of time to respond here. Looks like we had a quick lead for government officials of various types, which is excellent. This is definitely something that affects the programs that you interact with and help administer, as well as your constituents. But it also looks like we have a number of private sector individuals from a couple different sectors. Cool. So looks like our audience here is coming from a lot of different sectors. Not a surprise. This is something that affects you, whether or not it's happening in your jurisdiction or is relevant to your specific organization. This is really, really helpful. Cool. Let's go back to the presentation, please. So we can introduce today's speakers. Great. So we're joined today by Peter Ludwig, who leads market engagement for the Connecticut Green Bank's commercial and affordable multifamily market segments. In his role, he helps building owners, contractors, and others access Green Bank's clean energy financing program. So we'll be hearing from him first. We're also joined by Martin Powell, who is head of sustainability and environmental initiatives for Siemens Financial Services. He works with businesses, states, and cities to support them in achieving environmental, social, and economic goals. He's been involved in building strategies and developing pathways for organizations to achieve their ESG improvements, as well as roles in energy purchasing, including green funds. And lastly, we'll be joined by Natalie Campos Goodman, who's the founder of IncentiFind, a go-to database for commercial real estate and home improvement incentives. Her clean prop tech startup is radically increasing green construction across the US by connecting residential and commercial programs to the over $70 billion worth of incentives offered each year. IncentiFind promotes green practices such as energy efficiency, water conservation, solar, and electric vehicles, and more. And thank you all, each of you speakers for joining us today. With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Peter Ludwig to kick us off with his remarks. Peter?
Thank you so much, Kyle. And thank you so much to my fellow panelists and to everyone joining us for the conversation. So as Kyle mentioned, I work at the Connecticut Green Bank in a market engagement role. So I spent a lot of my time speaking with building owners and contractors about CPACE financing. So if you would go to the next slide, please. Brief agenda. I'll just introduce the Green Bank. I'll talk a little bit about what CPACE is and how it works. Then we'll talk a little bit about our CPACE for New Construction program. We'll talk quickly about a case study just to kind of ground you in a real project. A couple of takeaways, and then kind of some things I'm thinking about that might help to try to extrapolate our Connecticut-specific experience to folks who might be in different markets across the country thinking about CPACE. Next slide, please. So very quickly, just wanted to touch on the Green Bank. We're a quasi-public organization. We're set up by Connecticut state statute. Our focus is really on clean energy financing. That includes renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicle infrastructure, and charging stations. And we focus on leveraging public capital with multiples of private capital. We're supported by a variety of funding sources, including a surcharge on electric ratepayer bills. We get proceeds from a regional greenhouse gas initiative, which is sort of cap and invest program we have in the Northeast. We also sometimes win federal awards, and we also raise money through green bonds and interest income, and sometimes foundation or private investors. So we have kind of a mix of funding sources. Next slide, please. And the main point of this slide is I just wanted you to know that we work in many different parts of the built environment, and we work on home solutions. We also have some investment solutions where people can we raise money through, as I said, selling bonds, and also very small denomination investments we called Green Liberty Notes, which have been very successful, really democratizing access to clean energy investment. We also have on the bottom right-hand quadrant community solutions. But today, CPACE really lives in our building solutions programs. So I just wanted to give you an idea of overall what we do. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about CPACE. I'm sure that many folks have heard of it. I'm sure there are folks on the call who are well versed in it. CPACE stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, and at a very high level, the state of Connecticut, along with I think about 26 other states or so in the country, have recognized clean energy improvements as a public good. So towns across the state can opt into the program, and it allows building owners to secure long-term financing for clean energy improvements to the property with a senior lien, and they're paid back along with, in Connecticut at the same time as property taxes. So it is a way of extending out to 25-year terms, and it's a very secure kind of financing because it's secured with what we call a voluntary benefit assessment, similar to a sewer assessment on the property. So in Connecticut, we can cover up to 100% of the cost of the clean energy upgrades. We do have a statutory requirement that the project has a savings to investment ratio of greater or equal to 1, and that means that the cost savings from the clean energy improvement must be greater than the cost of the project over the useful life. So for a simple example, if you had a rooftop solar system that costs $1 million, and the useful life was expected to be 20 years, you need to have $1,001 things over that time frame in order for us to cover that cost. The owner then repays over the term through what we call a non-accelerating senior assessment, and we'll talk more about what that means. And then what's really nice is that the assessment stays with the property regardless of ownership. So this is a program really designed for commercial real estate. If you think about being a building owner who maybe would like to go from a less efficient boiler to a more efficient system, but a heat pump system might be too expensive, or might have the payments on financing might be too steep over a shorter term. You can spread those payments out over 20 or 25 years with a fixed interest rate, in the sort of rates in our market are usually about 5 or 6%. That can be really attractive to a lot of building owners. And one other thing I want to say about this is the idea that the assessment is a senior lien or it's secured with a senior lien, but it's not accelerating, meaning that in the case that there's a foreclosure, the bank who holds the first mortgage does not have to worry about the CPACE lender being in a first position, because the CPACE loan will outlast that ownership transfer. The CPACE lender will only need the payment that is due in that tax cycle, and then the rest of the loan can be paid off, and there's plenty of value left for that senior mortgage holder. So usually it's really designed to work in tandem with a senior mortgage holder. Next slide, please. So this is sort of just a snapshot of the kind of projects we're doing in Connecticut, the range of projects. It's for all kinds of different commercial buildings. Municipal and state buildings are not eligible, but really any kind of commercial building is. And so if you're, in an economic development office, imagine, a program that's totally free to your town, where private capital can be brought in and leveraged to help local building owners really invest in their buildings and increase their net operating income. If you're a property owner, think about being able to stretch their payments out over longer terms and see deeper savings. Maybe if you want to use the capital you might have used to replace a boiler, or a lighting system, and use that for growing your business, or if you're a nonprofit organization, for serving the community you serve more deeply, or rolling out new programs. And if you're a bank, if you have the note on the property, imagine a really secure type of financing that doesn't really interfere with the value of your asset, but in fact, it can strengthen the asset. And then if you're a CPACE lender, and we are a program administrator and a lender, imagine a very secure product where defaults are really rare. And then if you're a contractor, of course, or a project developer, you have another tool you can use to layer with utility incentives to close larger deals with deeper savings. And then, of course, if you're a municipal climate leader, or it's really thinking about emissions and decarbonization, and you have a source of private capital that can really make significant reductions in site energy use intensity and emissions. And so I just, up to date, we've done about 375 projects to the tune of about 250 million over the last roughly 9 years. So the program has scaled up a lot. And I'd like to pivot, if you would go to the next slide, please, to our new construction program, because it's a little bit different, and it's really it's newer, and it really gets at the idea that we want to build, when we're thinking about decarbonization, we want to build right the first time. We have, in this program, there's been about 9 projects that have closed to the tune of about 40 million. So they tend to be larger projects than the retrofit projects that we have done more of over the last few years. And the idea behind the new construction program is essentially, in this graphic, it shows you a developer capital stack, with some senior debt and some other kinds of equity and debt. And the idea on the left is either that CPACE does not compete with the senior lender, but it might be cheaper than some kinds of equity or other kinds of debt, so it can really reduce the overall cost of capital for the developer. Or on the right, it might just mean that since it's a little bit cheaper money, there just might be more available capital, so that you don't have to value engineer certain efficiency items out. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk briefly about the process, and if it's confusing, that will actually play into my later thoughts and about how you might proceed with CPACE or think about it. So the way it works in our state, according to our guidelines, is that a developer has to come up with construction plan and a whole building model that shows that the building is going to perform better than the energy code they're complying with. We then, as the Green Bank, will look at the model, the building model, it could be eQuest or a couple different models, and send backup documentation. We then review that. let the customer know, how much CPACE financing is available, and it closes and enters repayment. So it is a pretty technical process. Next slide, please. And this slide, I won't get into a lot of detail, but it's the sort of point is that there's a step-by-step process where, at the end, you can access 30% of your total, almost all of your total construction costs, except you do have a sort of this technical steps you have to go through are not always apparent, or the average developer in our market is not always intuitively does not understand this. Next slide, please. I guess since I only have about a minute and a half, I'll just say that this is one of the projects in our pilot that was really successful, and this developer did a wonderful job, Bruce Becker, and he's also a very experienced developer who thinks about green retrofits and green building all the time. So this will be, you can look up the links if you want to learn more about it, but it's almost 40% above building code baseline. Next slide, please. So we're also really moving towards electrification and decarbonization in the state. As such, we have included the option of additional capital being available if you pursue some bonus technologies like charging stations for electric vehicles. We've tried to really coordinate closely with utility programs to help customers really maximize their efficient design. We also have an open program design that allows new contractors, capital providers, and developers to come into the program. We really want it to be an ecosystem that works. And I think that we've noticed to grow the program and to really launch the new construction program, education is really key. I mean, we're out talking to all of our partners all the time. And I've also included a couple of links to kind of give you an idea of what our state is thinking about in terms of building decarbonization. And I have one or two more slides. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I think just a couple quick takeaways. This program works well with CPACE. We've deployed almost 300 million in capital. It is a free economic development tool. We really pride ourselves on leveraging currently approximately $7 of private capital for every $1 of public capital. And we work, it just takes a lot of work to partner with people, to coordinate on the customer's behalf to make sure that they're getting the right mix of rebates, incentives, technical assistance, and this is really an area of deep focus for us right now. And if you go to the next slide, so as I started to think about, if I was a building owner in another market, what would I do? And I think one thing is if you're financing or refinancing or going for a mortgage on a commercial property, try to talk to your lender about CPACE, because CPACE does require consent from the mortgage holder since it is a senior lien. Finding someone who can really, if it's a retrofit project or a new construction project, who can really outline a cost-effective scope that makes sure you're getting the most performance out of the building, and also you have the best mix of incentives and financing, and also understands all the nuances of these different programs, because they're going to vary between the green bank and the utility companies. They're going to vary in different states. There are other program administrators like the Green Bank who can be a great resource to help you talk through this. And there are also some resources at pacenation.org where you can actually click in and see, is there a CPACE program in your state? Is it active? And that sort of thing. And I believe that is the end of my, I think is there one more slide, or it's just a thank you slide?
Just a thank you slide, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for going over a little.
No, thank you so much for your remarks, Peter. Next up, we're going to hear from Martin Powell at Siemens Financial Services. Martin, you ready?
I'm ready. I'm just putting my camera on. Hopefully you can see me. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. This is not a presentation actually about finding capital, because there are, as you've seen, there are lots of financial allies out there. This is about ensuring you're doing the right decarbonisation projects, making the right technology choices, and then how best to access capital that keeps your risk to a minimum. And I'll explain a little bit more as we go through. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, I'd like to explain a little of the context of who we are. Siemens Financial Services is part of Siemens, which have a number of technology divisions around smart infrastructure. We do digital industries, big mobility schemes, IoT consulting. And that actually translates into financing expertise in that left pillar, which is decarbonisation, better use of resources in that middle pillar, and on the right, better outcomes for people. So we're very focused on community and also local, how local government can interact with us to drive more community type projects. Next slide, please. And you can go ahead and unravel it. Thank you. Next level of pressure. There's pressure on supply chains. I think we've all seen this now. Small, medium enterprises, SMEs, are being asked to provide a level of detail that I've never seen before by big business. This is on the left an example of a Fortune 100 software company that's signed up to science-based targets, as many big businesses have, such as ours. And they're asking every single supplier for every contract to calculate their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then the value of the contract is divided by their annual revenues so that the company can understand exactly the amount of carbon that's being passed in the course of this contract. So in the past, if you're a small business competing or bidding on a $50,000 contract, the winner is now being chosen for those with the lowest carbon emissions. This is a real shift. The other, and I'll also come back to that in a moment. On the right-hand side, of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission are driving much greater transparency. So we're simply going to see this effect compounded through all businesses. I'm sure you've heard this before, but 99% of American businesses are small to medium enterprises, employing over 60 million people. And they're going to have to directly reduce emissions by 20%. That's the pressure that will come from the company that signed up to science-based targets, just to survive. So they're going to have to do that right away. The progressive reduction of 100% reduction over time is just to stay competitive. So it's a real game changer. This isn't a question of buying offsets. This is a question of showing real reduction across the assets that these companies own and run. Next slide, please. It's very clear, and again, you can unravel it. Thank you. That companies' supply chain should be targeted, but it should be supported as well. So supply chains in our organization are over 15 times higher than our operational emissions. So it makes sense for us to expect more from our suppliers in terms of decarbonisation, but also to support them in that journey as well. This shouldn't be about getting our SMEs to reduce their emissions without helping with support. And it's also very clear, I get, 3 emails a week with an offer from an organization to help me baseline my emissions. So it's no surprise that an SME without any in-house expertise doesn't know where to begin, and probably more importantly, doesn't know who to trust and where to get their advice from. Next slide, please. So I just want to cover these three elements here. On the left-hand side, we've built a tool that can help SMEs understand how to reduce emissions, not what their baseline is, but actually what they could do to make a meaningful reduction. The right technology choices, what the paybacks look like, how the business case is then generated. And it's a very agnostic tool. I mean, we will give this away. Others will be trained to use it that are supporting SMEs with training and advice. And this tool will then also enable them to understand not just what the baseline is, but how they can meaningfully reduce it. The SME can then really take their time, consider the different scenarios that the tool generates, and then think about the balance of procuring some offsets, maybe as definitely some on-site energy efficiency measures with fast paybacks, maybe some longer-term on-site clean energy generation, and then it might be a question of them having to electrify their fleets or other parts of their operations, so some EV charging. They can then decide how to procure this through any means. They could just do direct project finance or a direct loan. The loan could also be linked to carbon outcomes or energy reduction outcomes. And if they achieve those, the rates on those loans could be better, so sustainability linked. And the proposition can also be combined together, so a fully financed technical solution, a turnkey solution that guarantees the outcomes. And the beauty of this is that you're taking the stress away from the SME who is unsure where to begin, how to baseline their emissions, unsure of the technologies that they may have to use and deploy. They are now seeing a fully baked offer with very clear paybacks and also very clear commitments on what that will mean for emissions. And I think while the majority of SMEs lack capacity and capital, this may be a much more meaningful way for businesses to go about decarbonizing their operations. And next slide, please. Just as Peter did, I'd just very briefly like to show a case study in Princeton in our facility there. It's just a regular business park. We put some on-site, what we call fisheye solar, so it tracks with the sun. We put energy efficiency measures in, which is absolutely critical. No building should have clean power without ensuring that you maximize the efficiency of how that energy is used first. We put some storage. It's got a microgrid, so it can operate in an islanded mode, and some EV charging, and all of that talks to one another, and we monitor and show that up in the building for all to see how it's used and how it performs, so that people can A, come and see it, but B, also understand what a neat package solution could look like. And I won't go into any more detail. You'll see there's a link there, so please do have a look, and we're more than happy to invite you to come and see it. Next slide, please. So just two more slides, just to finish. 15 years ago, I conducted an experiment. These are my children, Tessa, Jacob, and Albert, and my chickens, Daphne and Josephine. I've since gained a child, and we've lost the chickens, unfortunately. But this was an experiment to show you what 80 liters of water look like. So if you just click one slide, I filled the paddling pool with 80 liters of water. I couldn't visualize it. And the reason I did it, I wanted to see, this is the carbon neutral definition of water use per person per day in a domestic setting, so in our homes. So if you want to be considered a carbon neutral position when it comes to water, then 80 liters is what you have to get to. I can tell you in the US, we consume 280 litres per person per day. So a long way to go. Nowhere in the world actually gets close to 80 litres. But I wanted to show it because this is what we need to start doing with energy. We have to visualize it, we have to measure it, how we use it, where we consume it better. Then we can begin to manage how we decarbonize. We can then finance it, and then we can implement with real precision so that more and more businesses will guarantee the outcomes, guarantee the performance of those assets over the life cycle. And that will give much more trust to those that don't know where to begin and want to rapidly move forward. And that's really the energy journey ahead of us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Martin. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Natalie Goodman for her remarks. Natalie?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. We can head into the first slide. So you heard from some different financing mechanisms. Today I'm going to talk about green building incentives. Next slide, please. Incentifine is the nation's go-to database for green building incentives. As you can see here, we're transforming the US to go green using $70 billion worth of incentives. And I'll give you a sneak peek into our database here in a second. We are headquartered out of Houston, Texas. We do service all 50 states, no US territories, and expect our continued expansion into Canada. Next slide. So here's what you can find in Incentifine's database. We are considered the only holistic database. It means that we house incentives from federal, state, county, city, and utility level governments. We have over 500,000 ways to save when building green. Our database is worth about $70 billion per year. And you can see the incentive types that we house: tax, grants, fee waivers, rebates, bill credits, and loan programs. Our database houses the green incentives you see on the screen. It's all things energy efficiency, indoor and outdoor, all things renewables, all things water conservation, both indoor and outdoor. We further house incentives related to the land that an asset sits on. And the only way we go horizontal are electric vehicle charge stations. And you can see that we house incentives applicable to the commercial sector, residential, new construction, existing buildings, publicly owned assets, as well as privately owned and tenant leases. Next slide. This is one of my favorite slides. No, I'm not going to go over every single bullet. It's really just the ones in dark green. But I always ask our incentive research team, anytime we have an audience like yourselves, what's one takeaway that you would want the audience members to absorb about incentives? And you would think across all our team members, there would be some overlap, right? And there's not. And I think that's very reflective of just how the nature of incentives, I mean, it does vary by level of government, incentive type, how it's applied. There's a lot of nuances when it comes to incentives, right? So the three things I'm going to talk about today from this slide is that realize half of all incentives go unclaimed simply because of lack of awareness or basic incentive knowledge. So we're going to give you a primer today. The other thing is to realize funds from incentives, they're limited. It's first come, first served basis. We say funds typically open each January for most incentive programs. And then as funds are reserved, right, they'll deplete on into December, where incentive programs will close. And then again, funds will be replenished in January. And then the last bit, you wouldn't believe how many developers show up to Incentifine with a core and shell project or a project they've built and designed to basic building code and say, oh, what incentives are available to me? The building, the home must conserve energy or water in some shape or form, or it can produce renewable energy as well. Next slide. So here's some of the primers about incentives. Everyone on a project team can benefit from incentives. Up at the top, you can see developers, owners, or tenants realize that incentives can reduce the cost of a project, right? They might help close some of those funding gaps, but incentives will never fully fund a project, and incentives will never be provided in advance of the project. They're typically paid out after construction completion. For representatives that are in the audience today, or project managers or program managers, realize that incentives do not delay projects. In fact, they can help a project stay on budget. For any architects, engineers, or other design team members on the line today, realize that incentives can help your owners achieve their design goals. And sometimes we've seen them help avoid value engineering, which is really nice. For GCs on the line or installers, same thing here. Incentives can help create well-funded projects. And should you find yourself in a value engineering exercise, remember, use incentives to help with those equipment changes and keep that owner on track for their sustainability goals. Next slide. The critical roles that everyone plays on a project team when it comes to incentives. This slide actually is surprising to most of our audiences. I think it's pretty obvious that if you're developer, owner, tenant, if they're not on board with capturing or being the beneficiary of incentives, well, the project's not going to be able to capture them, right? Your beneficiary needs to be on board. For your project managers or representatives on the line, realize you are the most critical team member in identifying incentives as far as timing goes. And we're going to talk about timing here in a second. Design team members, you're the most critical team member when it comes to identifying incentives, but also running the cost benefit analysis. We have a lot of developers that ask Incentify, are you gonna do the ROI on my incentive? No, that's what your design team does, right? We're just the database team. Here's the most surprising team member. And we've seen a lot of projects lose incentives because the GC or installer was not on board with helping to capture the incentives. They are the most critical team member when it comes to applying and receiving funds from incentives, because many incentives will require certain project documents during the construction and installation phase that only the GC can provide in a timely fashion. So my best advice here is make sure your GC's on board, engage with them early on. Next slide. Value statement. So here's that timeline. We always get asked, what's the best time to consider incentives if we want to leverage them on our project? That's pretty easy. You can never consider incentives too early. Incentives, we've been part of location strategy, engagements, right? The design phase, most optimal time to consider incentives, especially if you want to maximize how much you can receive from incentives by working with your design team to look at more energy efficient solutions or more water conserving solutions or solar related solutions, right? So design phase, perfect time to consider incentives. If you're at the tender phase, which is when you typically as an owner are going to look for that architect or that GC, you're kind of getting to like bottom of the ninth, right? You're going to need to really think about incentives very quickly. And more than likely at the tender phase, whatever the design solution that's already been established by the architect, incentives are probably just going to reward that solution. If you're at the construction phase, meaning a wrench is turned or a shovel's gone into the ground, for existing building assets that are undergoing an upgrade, right? Or a major retrofit, you could be too late, to be honest, because most of your existing buildings, they have to have their existing conditions documented so that the incentive programs can say, well, what was existing in the building and what was it upgraded to? Incentives are paid off of that difference, right? So if the existing conditions aren't documented, you cannot go after those incentives, right? For new construction, you are definitely at the bottom of the ninth. You need to consider those incentives. They are only going to reward the design solution. And if a project is at certificate of occupancy or handover, consider incentives kind of out the gate. Rarely have we seen incentives that are retroactive. So again, design phase is the best time. Next slide. I'm going to show a few case studies because I think incentives are best seen in practice and through storytelling. So we can head into the first case study. Here we have a multi-building redevelopment. Everyone always thinks about incentives applicable to a single building, We've seen cases where we have a new construction building, an existing building on the same plot that's being renovated. So here's a great example of a project in Central Texas. Notice down at the bottom, the developer came to incentivize during the conceptual design phase, optimal time to consider incentives. They plugged in some project credentials, and our system said there's about $1.5 million worth of incentives across your 12 buildings. Would you like to look at the incentives that are available? They progressed, the developer progressed to the second step of our third step process, and notice that out of 42 incentives, 18 were selected. Look, not every incentive is going to be right for a project. Your design team will help the owners understand which are the best incentives to go after, right? And then after the 18 incentives were selected, appropriate documents were provided in a timely fashion by the GC. And notice we were able to help the owner capture about $500,000 in cash reimbursements. And up at the very top of the right screen, you can see the developer was able to realize cost savings through incentives to keep the project on time and within budget. Next case study. All right, here's a public hospital. We get asked all the time, well, if it's not a tax-paying entity, they can't get incentives. And that's actually not the case. So long as the public entity pays the electric, water, gas bills, they're eligible for incentives. So let's take a look at a public hospital. Down at the bottom, notice the MEP engineering firm. They approached us during the design phase, optimal time to consider incentives. We revealed some potential savings and progressed to the second step, which is to analyze the 13 incentives. 6 were selected based on the project scope and timing, and appropriate documentation was provided to capture the incentives you see at the bottom right-hand screen. And the goal is up at the top, so the public institution was able to achieve cost savings, right, reducing their overall operating expenditures. Next slide. So you've seen some holistic upgrades or new construction. Here's a one-off equipment upgrade to a building, just some rooftop solar, right, on an existing asset. Same thing here. Building owner, notice they came to us during construction mobilization. That is bottom of the ninth. We had to act very quickly. Out of the 13 incentives, the owner quickly selected 8, provided immediate document access from their solar installer, and we were able to get some cash reimbursements, as you see it down at the bottom, as well as some tax-related incentives. Next slide. Last but not least, you saw some one-off projects, some one-off buildings, new construction, existing buildings. You also saw a one-off equipment case study. Here's a portfolio. Now it's just 7 hotels. We've seen up to, I don't know, about 1,000 assets in a single, portfolio come through our system. So in this case, the developer approached incentivized during location strategy. Where do I put my hotels, my 7 new hotels? Notice our system returned some estimates of potential cost savings. We had to look over a lot of incentives, right? We had 7 assets. So out of 93, 42 incentives were selected across the 7 assets. And you can see appropriate documentation was provided in a timely manner. And we were able to help this owner capture both cash reimbursements as well as the tax incentives you see down at the bottom. And the goal here up at the top is that the developer was able to achieve critical sustainability goals for their new stakeholder requirements. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. And now we're going to start our Q&A portion. So if you haven't already, you can join us over at slido.com and enter the event code DOE to submit and upvote some of the existing questions. And if I could just bring up the speakers, you turn off your or turn on your webcam so we can get started with some questions. I'm going to start with a general one that came in from the Q&A, which is, how do you handle the too good to be true questions when people hear about your programs, hear about your offering, and think to themselves, okay, that sounds great, but what's the catch? What's going on here? And Peter, this was specifically phrased in terms of CPACE, so maybe we can start with you and then hear from the other panelists about how you handle that question.
Sure. Let's see. I guess I'm always pretty upfront about the CPACE is not it's not a entirely simple process, right? It's not like an on-bill financing program where you can close on it in 3 days or something. So, and there's, the question of like lender consent. There are a couple of flags that we usually try to identify early on in a conversation with a customer or a contractor, and try to temper the excitement and enthusiasm that we all might feel about getting a project developed. And I think usually that kind of approach just grounds the conversation in reality and tends to build trust.
Okay, got it. So being honest about just how, that it's not an effortless process. So if it sounds too good to be true, maybe they should revisit the the guidelines and the requirements. Martin, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I like Peter's answer. I think you've got to show a technical solution that's fully financed, and you've got to show people what it's going to cost and what the payback is and what the risks are. And I think generally there's not enough projects that are done like that. I'll respond directly, if I may, in Slido, because I got the most likes, and it kind of answers this question. Most likes to this question, which was, did I say the ESG maturity tool is free? Obviously, the word free seems to stimulate. It is free, but it's not like one of these online tools where you can kind of calculate, if you put 2 solar panels on your roof, what would the paybacks look like. This is a complicated tool for an industrial setup, right? And so what we would do is partner with any organization that is looking to support a group of SMEs. We would help educate them in how to use the tool so it's deployed properly. As you can imagine, building up those business cases, requires some precision, and we pride ourselves in doing that. So absolutely yes is the answer, but it's not something that we would just give away freely. We would work with a partner organization to do it.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like for both of you, it's a question about process and clarity is one of the key ways to answer
and
this
accuracy. Again, as Peter alluded to, this is about providing people with a very clear view of what the end game looks like.
Natalie, any response from you?
Oh, I echo both what Peter and Martin are saying. I mean, as you saw in the presentation that I gave, timing is everything, and having the right conversation at the right time with the right stakeholders. I mean, that's the best way to manage this too good to be true kind of mindset, is because you're going to quickly look at accurate sets of data. Incentives might be one of them. Other financing mechanisms might be the others. And it's going to force those conversations to happen. And throughout those conversations, so long as there's good goal setting, right? And an alignment to those goals, the outcome, I think the expectations will be managed, and it'll lose, the solution will lose that, oh, is this too good to be true? And I think a clear path forward for how to fund the project will reveal itself.
Great. For our next question, I'm going to shift over to the Inflation Reduction Act. So on the general subject of the IRA, what do you think will be the biggest change that is worth waiting for as the IRA gets rolled out? And what is not going to change, and what is therefore not worth waiting for when it comes to the IRA? And Natalie, maybe we can start with you on this question, just because it's you probably get it a lot.
Oh, we get it a lot. Actually, I had a slide, but I don't know why the background wasn't showing up on it. So here's what we do know about the IRA. And let me preface with, a lot of people didn't realize this, but during COVID, many incentive programs changed overnight. One example is many incentive programs would require on-site inspections so that incentive program managers could see the eligible equipment was in fact installed, right? And we had to change all of these programs overnight, right? And we were able to do that just by close engagement with federal, state, county, city, and utility level governments, right? The IRA bill is not going to be any different. We're going to approach it with that same, methodology that we did all of the pandemic changes that we saw, right? Our eyes are dead set right now at the federal level. We've seen some tax incentives already being unveiled that are, I think, going to be exciting for a lot of real estate developers. After those federal level incentives, from the state onwards down to the utility level, I mean, most incentive programs run January to December. So what we're going to anticipate, and through our engagements already with many utility companies and cities, is that come January, you're going to see additional funds allocated, or perhaps some new incentive programs promoting newer green technologies, right, will come out. But it's still a wait and see. So we think a lot of new programs could be deployed in January, or just additional funding provided in existing programs. And then also the same thing for the following year, just because it doesn't make sense to radically change an incentive program mid-year, right? You typically want to follow that calendar year deployment.
So yeah, if you haven't heard about something that would be relevant for you the following year, come January, then don't wait for the Uncertainty of the Future Act now.
No, I wouldn't. And to be honest, I mean, there's still $70 billion in incentives available that, you know, it needs to be utilized. So there's plenty of funds out there. I think get excited about additional funds coming down the pipeline, but there's still plenty of funds available for projects across the US.
Yeah.
Martin or Peter, yeah.
Yeah, if I could just chip in, I really agree with Natalie. There's lots of funds out there, but on this is very existence is going to put even more focus on this. And the other thing, with the energy efficiency component is exciting, because if you stand on top of the Empire State Building in New York, or any tall building in your city, and look around you, 80% of the buildings you see will still be there by 2050. So this is about looking at the infrastructure we have, figuring out how to decarbonize it, how to retrofit it in a way that's meaningful, that's making meaningful reductions. And I think this very act is going to get a lot more people focused on it. So it's exciting times. It's great.
Great, thanks. All right, I mean, we have a lot of really exciting additional questions, but I think we'll need to shift over to our closing remarks so that we can end this webinar on time. Thank you all so much for your time. Oh, sorry, Peter, unless you have anything to add on the IRA. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all of you so much for your time and remarks here and your thoughtful response to these questions. There we go. So this webinar is part of the 2022-2023 Better Buildings webinar series. And you can see there's a great lineup of presentations all the way through March. We're just in the second box here, right? We got a lot of content to go through in the coming weeks and months. You can visit the Better Building Solution Center to learn more about any of these sessions and to register for any of them. Next slide, please. We hope specifically that you're going to join us for the next webinar on October 4th. The title session is Sustainability and Decarbonization Inside Warehouses and Distribution Centers. Join this webinar to explore ways warehouse owners and operators have achieved energy savings and explore the role their buildings play in sustainability and resilience. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists again very much for taking the time for us. Feel free to contact our presenters directly with the contact information on this slide with additional questions that we weren't able to get through today. I saw a lot of really good ones coming through the Q&A. I wish we had just another hour and a half, honestly, just to discuss some of these. I encourage you to follow the Better Buildings Initiative on LinkedIn and Twitter for all the latest news and releases. You can find our handles by the respective icons on the left-hand side of the screen. Lastly, you will receive an email notice when today's recording, slides, and transcripts are available on the Better Building Solution Center. Thank you all so much for joining today. And with that, we'll close.